Very welcome to you all to this online workshop. This is hosted by South Asian Bioethics Community and Early Career Bioethics Network. To begin myself, I'm Dr. Supriya Subramani. I'm a lecturer at Sydney Health Ethics, School of Public Health, University of Sydney. I recently joined, I can't say recently, I think it's been a year now. I'm the founder and member of these two communities, purely run by amazing scholars who are here, few of them, who are just willing to be here for each other and learn with each other. Of course, as academia is as precarious it is, so it's nice that we are there, right? So I take this opportunity to thank many of the co-organizers and members of these networks. And today's webinar is one of the efforts to support early career researchers to help think about peer review and also reflect around the process with our amazing speakers today here. I hope this webinar helps for early career researchers because it's quite a vast multidisciplinary spaces we work with, right? Whether it's bioethics, public health ethics, or all the subsets of ethics, which we are part of. So the format of this session would be, first I'll introduce each speaker briefly because they have an amazing CV. Please go and read and engage with their works. And they will give short talk for 20 minutes. And then we will take one or two questions, like very quick questions for 10 minutes. And finally, we will have last 20 minutes for general question and answer session so that we can have this as a panel conversation. So just a quick note, please mute yourself. And if you have any questions during Q&A, please raise your hand and I will call out your name and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. But if you are uncomfortable, of course, feel free to write on the chat. And during the Q&A, I will either ask the question to the panel or if there are too many questions, I'll summarize thematically and ask question. So our first speaker, Professor Angus Dawson, he is Professor of Bioethics at Center for Biomedical Ethics at NUS. His main research interests are in public health ethics, research ethics, and methodology in bioethics. He was a joint founder of the journal Public Health Ethics and has been its joint editor-in-chief since it began, I think it began in 2008. So please check out his many amazing works in public health ethics. Angus will be talking to us on the role and the expectations of peer reviewer. Over to you, Angus.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And thanks very much for your leadership in the communities which you are part of. I think this is today just one example of many of the kind of great work that you do. So sorry about this, but I have a few slides. I'm hoping that we can just have a bit of a conversation, but I thought just to get things started, I would have a few prompts for the discussion. So maybe I should begin by saying, because I'm by far the oldest person here, I've been around working in the field of bioethics for a long time. And it's very interesting to think about how academia in general, but the expectations in relation to journals have actually changed over the course of that time. I think one of the main things that's happened is that there's been such a dramatic explosion in the numbers of journals, the numbers of publications, the pressure and expectation that is upon all of us in relation to generating publications and so on. And that in itself creates some potential problems for journals and for reviewers. And hopefully we can come back to some of those and talk about them in a little bit. But I don't know why, but I always have this problem. So this is what I have decided to do, is to basically have a series of questions just as a way to kind of structure things. And I hope I don't tread on too many toes of my colleagues who are going to be talking afterwards. I tried to avoid what I thought you might touch on, but who knows? I apologize in advance if I do that. So let's get started. Why should you review? So let me just see if I can move this. Yeah. So this alludes back to this issue that I've already brought up about the fact that the pressure and the busyness and so on of academia I think has really changed. I think we're all under pressure to achieve various kinds of things within our institutions as a way to get promotion or to get tenure and so on. And very often, I think that people are told that they shouldn't do reviewing. I've heard more senior people tell more junior colleagues precisely that. So I thought it might be good to just start off by asking this question, why should you actually be engaged in the review process? And I think it's something that you can see there are a number of reasons why this might be a good thing for both you as the reviewer, but also for the community surrounding a particular journal itself. So the first thing here is to see the actual review process from the other side, as it were. So when you are submitting work to any reputable journal anyway, I'll leave aside predatory journals that will just take anything for a fee. For a reputable journal, there will be a review process, and chances are that you will have gone through that process yourself before being asked to be a reviewer. Because the most common reason why you might be asked to be a reviewer is because your name comes up in relation to a particular topic when a search is conducted. So sometimes you will just get a request out of the blue. This happens to me almost every day these days. And it's because people have done like a Google Scholar search for a particular topic, and your name comes up in relation to that. So once you start publishing, you will get these unsolicited invitations from journals. And a good thing to do is to be aware that many of those will be from good journals and some will be from predatory journals. So just watch out. So one of the advantages of doing the reviewing yourself, as it were, being on the other side, is that you see the process from the other side. So rather than being the victim, as it were, of the reviewer's comments, you are engaging in that process yourself. And I think that can be a really valuable lesson in terms of understanding more about how journals work, but also the expectations of what it takes to actually be a reviewer yourself. There's part of the engagement with the community around a particular journal or around a particular discipline or around a particular topic, which maybe you're interested in and you've published on, and that's why you're being invited to review. So seeing other people's work in advance before publication, being able to provide an input into that, and ideally, you're contributing thoughts into that process, and you're entering into the kind of academic conversation which at its best is still there in a lot of academic work. It's useful in terms of career development. So being able to say that you've reviewed for a number of different journals, that can be useful when it's when you're going up for promotion. Other kinds of advancement, professional reasons. It can be a really good thing to demonstrate that you're contributing to a community, that you're not just thinking about your own research, you're not thinking about research in a sort of selfish or self-interested way, which I must admit I do occasionally come across. And then lastly, maybe I can put on my journal editor's hat here and say, most importantly, it's absolutely essential. So essentially, most reviewing is done for free. So it's a contribution that you are making in the expectation that your own work will be in turn reviewed, because without that process, your own work won't be published. So it's essentially a form of reciprocity to actually contribute to the community in this particular way. And I have to say that it's seems to be becoming more and more difficult to actually find reviewers for things. So recently with papers, I've asked 10 or 12 people who are authorities on those particular topics, and everybody says that they're busy. So it's a real problem that journals rely upon contributions from people, and it's absolutely essential to get the process underway. So where does a reviewer fit in? And this goes to thinking about the expectations and the responsibilities of being a reviewer. Essentially, you're being asked to contribute as an expert on a particular topic. So if you don't feel that you are able to, that you have the relevant expertise to review a paper fairly, it's perfectly fine to say that to the editors or whoever it is that the emails come from, and explain that the particular methodology, for example, is one that you're not familiar with, or maybe the topic isn't really in your area. And a good thing to do is to actually provide some alternatives if you know anybody who might be a more suitable reviewer. But essentially, the role of the reviewer, as I see it, is advising the editor or the editors of the journal. So you are giving an opinion about a particular paper, and you are helping the author or authors of the paper to think about things that they might have missed, or how to present something more clearly, or how a piece of literature or a body of literature that they've missed could actually add to their arguments, etc., etc. So it's really important to see that your role is not to just say yes or no in relation to a paper. I have occasionally seen reviews where they come in and they're just one line, and they just says something like, reject, this is not suitable for publication. I think Vijay will be going on to talk more about the reviewers' reports and how to construct them in a little bit, but that's a completely unhelpful report. So most often with most journals, you would have at least 2 reviewers' reports. And with some journals, you will actually get to see the other reviewers' reports. And again, this is one of the very interesting and potentially useful roles of being a reviewer. So for journals like the one that I co-edit, Public Health Ethics, as a reviewer, you will get to see both your own review, of course, the other reviewers' comments, and any comments from the editors themselves in relation to, very often what we might do is to try and situate the reports. If there's some tension or disagreement between the 2 reports, we might say, in revising the paper, please take advantage or respond more to reviewer 1 because we think that's a more helpful review. Maybe reviewer 2 is a little bit harsher, and feel free to take that into account, but it's not essential to respond to those questions. Because we're an interdisciplinary journal, it's not unheard of to get a report that's basically saying there are these very minor things and then say accept, and also to get a reject. And this can just be to do with different disciplinary expectations and so on. So sometimes we get very grumpy reviews from philosophers. I can say this, being trained in philosophy myself, where they're nitpicking about something. So it's not quite at the range of, there are 3 typos in this paper, reject. But it's almost at that level at times. So how do you become a reviewer? As I said before, most often these will be unsolicited invitations to participate in the reviewing process. And as I also said before, most journals are desperate for reviewers. And one of the things that you can do with most journals now, because of online submission and online reviewing, is you can register yourself through the, for example, Manuscript Central system with a particular journal and specify what your research interests are. And if you're interested in doing some reviewing, this is really useful, because before going to your sort of Google Scholar search to try and find a reviewer, you might actually do a review within the system itself. And that's usually down to keywords. So if you put in a suitable range of keywords, you know, don't just put in public health ethics. That's not going to help if we're talking about a journal like Public Health Ethics. But if you put down an interest in screening or global justice or brain drain, whatever it might be, you can put down a whole list of keywords. Then we'll be able to find you when we're looking for reviewers. Secondly, I think whenever you see any journal editors at conferences, come and talk to us. You know, let us know what your interests are. Let us know that you want to be involved in the reviewing process. And the other thing that you can do is talk to your mentors. Talk to your, if you're a PhD student or a postdoc, you know, talk to your supervisors or more senior colleagues, and talk to them about how you get involved in the review process. It might even be that if they're really good mentors, they will help you in relation to inviting you to participate in a review. It might be that they say, oh, I've got this paper to review. Maybe you could do a review yourself, and I'll do a review and we can compare them. Or they could possibly talk to the journal and say, would it be okay if I mentored this person through the submission of a review? And most journals are going to be very keen upon that, because it allows, again, a new generation, new blood coming into the system of the review community. So what should a reviewer do? This is really going to the fundamentals of thinking about essentially the responsibilities of being a reviewer. I think if you're going to do reviewing, you have to do it seriously, by which I mean you approach it in the right kind of way, that this is a task which you have to take seriously in terms of reading the paper very carefully and trying to be as generous and supportive and charitable as you possibly can. The best reviews are those that are most helpful to the authors, even if you are ultimately advising that a publication is not yet suitable for publication. So making sure that you are taking the time to understand the argument, perhaps not getting so hung up on the issues to do with language, that the primary factor that's important is thinking about, is the overall argument, is the overall paper saying something interesting and useful to the community? Does it advance a discussion? That's what's most important. So that's why you might need to go back and, for example, if a paper is a response to a previous paper, it might be worth taking the time to go back and refreshing yourself and making sure that you understand that prior paper, that this paper is a response to. Is the response paper, is it fair to that prior publication? How does the paper fit in within a series of work which is discussing a particular issue? These are things which are really important and really valuable to the authors themselves. There's no problem in actually being critical, of course, and offering some suggestions for improvements, but you have to offer reasons for that. You don't want to just say, this is terrible, reject. You know that, and again, I've seen reviews like that. That's completely useless to me as an editor or to the authors themselves. And just a couple of things on the more kind of process side of things. try and be timely in your response. It's no problem if you're a couple of days late. And if there's some major problem that's come up and you're going to take longer than that, then that's fine as well. Just let people know that an issue has come up. It's when things drag on for ages and ages that it's a problem. And one thing to watch out for is that different journals have different approaches in relation to their review process. So again, at Public Health Ethics, we have a system of complete blind review. So everybody, except for the editors, are blinded as to who the authors and who the reviewers are. But not all journals are like that. And it's not that you should take the opportunity for you to be blinded as a reviewer to use that as an act of taking the opportunity to be uncharitable or horrible about the content of the paper. But just be aware that at the opposite extreme from complete blinding is a paper like BMC Medical Ethics that will actually publish your review as part of the process itself. So it will be there forever attached to that particular paper, the original review and the original version that you responded to, and that before there will be then the final version. If there've been 2 rounds of reviews, both of your reviews will be there. And again, if you're interested in the review process, it can be very interesting to actually go back and look at the previous versions of papers and what reviewers have said, and how the authors themselves have actually responded to the papers. Again, some of that depends upon the quality of the actual reviews that are done. And I think there can be, personally, I'm not a big fan of open review because I think there's a danger that people know that their reviews are going to be online and that their names are going to be attached to them. So there can be a tendency to be a little bit uncritical. That's the danger of that particular process. So be aware in advance of what the system is, what the requirements are, and how your review is going to be presented. Is it only to the authors and the editors, or is it going to be there forever on the internet? What should a reviewer not do? This comes from many years of seeing completely unhelpful reviews, where it's really common, I think, for essentially a reviewer to ask for a different paper. I think that this is really common. And so what I mean by this is where somebody has written on a particular topic or they've adopted a particular methodology, and then the reviewer actually prefers a different methodology or thinks that actually this topic is really boring and maybe it would be more exciting to have a paper on this other topic, which is slightly related but a different topic. You know, again, it's not your job as a reviewer to suggest that this topic is really boring and somebody should do something else. You know, maybe it's helpful to review the particular paper itself and make suggestions for how the arguments could be advanced or how they could be applied in future work in a different area or to a different topic. That's useful, but don't just say this is a boring paper and you should do something else. And the next 2 bullet points there are really about sort of how you might have your own views about something, and this certainly comes through a lot with reviewers. There's a tendency perhaps to, again, make suggestions which are more relevant for that particular reviewer's work. Here, there's a tendency to offer some suggestions for things that the authors could read. Don't just make it a cut and paste from your own CV about your own work to try and boost citations. This has to be things which are genuinely going to be useful to the argument that is being presented by the author or authors themselves. Sometimes you can guess who's written a paper if you know a field particularly well, or it's a small field. And again, don't take that as an opportunity to kind of fight your own agendas in relation to, you know, if a paper is written by the people that you consider to be your worst intellectual enemies, then you need to take care there. And maybe this is something that will be picked up later on in terms of thinking about potential conflicts of interest. And I've already covered this problem about just kind of dismissing a paper by just saying this is rubbish or this is completely unhelpful or just reject. Where you are offering a critique, always tie that into particular examples within the paper. You know, give references in terms of what you mean by the particular problem. Don't just leave it as high-level critique. So I'll just end with some general tips in terms of, I'm so old that in the old days, the way that you got access to journals was to actually physically go to the library. I know most of you probably never go to the library anymore and only download things electronically. But there used to be the section of the library which was fantastic, and it was where the latest issues of the journals used to be. So as a PhD student, I used to go down and I'd sit there. There were some very nice comfy chairs, and you could physically go through the latest issues of the journals in your field, and you could get a sense of the journal about what the journal was actually looking for, what it was publishing, and so on. So I would really advise you to sign up for the table of content alerts, which most journals have now, as a way to then get to know a particular journal. What is it that a journal is looking for? Are there special issues that are on particular topics? Are there things which are gaps in a particular journal's coverage of a set of issues? There could be opportunities here for you as a reviewer to understand more about opportunities for you to then email the editors and say, oh, I noticed that you haven't published anything on this particular issue. You know, would you be interested in a paper on that as well? So by being engaged in reviewing, there are opportunities to then be engaged in the actual process of the production of papers. Secondly, a word of warning. This is not taking on too much in the sense of doing too many reviews at the same time, but also it goes back to this idea about getting to know a particular journal. So it's good to engage with a small number of journals in real depth, rather than seeking to cover like a huge range of journals. Which journals are most important to you? Where do you want to publish? And get to know those journals through doing reviewing for those journals. And the last point is a very practical one, which is because of online journal submissions for papers, but also for reviewing process, don't do what's happened to me a couple of times, which is that you get halfway through a review and your internet crashes or something, and you lose all the work that you put in relation to that particular review. Do reviews offline and then cut and paste into the system. Don't do it live, as it were, unless you live somewhere with very, very secure internet, which is virtually nowhere in the world. So thanks a lot. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Angus. This is really helpful to give a big overview, but at the same time talk about like how very often the review systems make us, wants us to critically think about it. Like, like as you were talking about it just made me think of the image of the burger, which is like all the burger, which is like sandwich when reviewer asks us to do. But I really like your thought on reciprocity, like how in academia, the peer review system depends on this aspect. So it's really nice that you touched. Because of the time, so can we have one question from the audience, or if you have any questions? before moving on to other next speaker. Okay, looks like no questions. Maybe we'll have in the end. Okay, so our next speaker is Vijay, is Dr. Vijay Gobichandran. He works in India, in Chennai, and he volunteers in clinical services at different hospitals and clinics, and especially he engages with in remote areas, as I understand, as I know him. He serves as a working editor for the Indian Journal of Medical Ethics since 2014, and he has been very actively involved in supporting many students and early career researchers in India. He also consults for WHO for developing ethical guidelines for public health surveillance and also developing curriculum for training in ethics of implementation research. So today, Vijay will be talking to us on preparing a peer review report. So taking forward what Angus talked, I think there's a way to, if there's a clear scaffolding, I think, and I really look forward to listen to you, Vijay. Over to you. Vijay, you're muted, sorry.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect, thanks.
Thank you, Supriya, for this opportunity to speak to the group. And it's a great pleasure sharing this panel with Angus and Sabrina. I'm meeting Sabrina for the first time, and Angus has been a long-term friend and associate. And so in this presentation, I have a couple of declarations. One, I'm currently working editor of the Indian Journal of Medical Ethics, and most of what I'm going to talk now is from my experience of being an editor and as a peer reviewer earlier. And the second declaration is I am a medical doctor by training, and my disciplinary influence is going to show through all of the slides and all the things that I'm going to say. So in this presentation, I'll briefly talk to you about the process of performing a peer review. And I'll give you 10 different attributes of a useful peer review. What should a useful peer review look like? So this is a rough flow of how the peer review process happens. To me, personally, the first step in doing a peer review is to familiarize with the scope of the journal, the section under which this article is submitted, and instructions to the authors. I think this is what even Angus referred to about knowing the journal. I think this is crucial because it helps us to understand what kind of review that we are going to make regarding this article which is submitted. And after familiarizing with this, then the other steps, there is a lot of iterative back and forth between the other steps. The second step would be to do some background reading to familiarize with the topic. Usually, like Angus said, we are invited to do peer review because our name shows up in a search in relation to that area. But some amount of background reading or catching up with respect to what has happened since the time we published the paper to the current scenario would be useful to prime ourselves to review the paper. Then the most important thing is to read the paper completely. There are different styles of peer reviewing. Some people read, and as they are reading the article, they mark the comments. Like if it is a word processing document, there is a comments box, and they just put the comments as they are reading the article for the first time. I prefer not to do that because sometimes when I raise a question earlier, I get an answer for that when I read the paper subsequently. So what I do is I prefer to read the full paper once. And then in my second reading is when I mark these comments as and when I read the various parts. Then two aspects, especially if it is a research paper, two aspects that I would like to really critically engage with are, number one, the methodology that is adopted, the various nuances, the rigor, the methodological rigor that is involved, and then the validity, accuracy of the results and their interpretation. These are two things. Again, iteratively, I would like to go back and forth between methodology and results. And sometimes we may also have to go back to background reading to come back and see if the results are agreeing with what has already been said, or is there, if there is a difference, what are the interpretations of why there is a difference? Those kinds of engaged reading in an iterative manner, I think is very important. And finally, I think there is an important role for reflecting on what are the implications of this research paper or this article for the scientific world and for the society at large. And I think that reflection should also come in our peer review report. So this is roughly the process. Again, this is not a linear process. There is a lot of back and forth and iterative movements between the various sections in this process, in this peer review process. Now, I'll take you through some of the 10 attributes. I mean, this is not a etched in stone that there should be only these 10 attributes. There are probably much more. But these are the things which I usually look for in my own peer review reports when I prepare them. The first thing is a comment. The peer review report should situate this paper in the background knowledge that is already known. So it must provide a description of the existing knowledge. Like I would start my peer review report by saying the authors have done so-and-so research on so-and-so sample, and they have done this. And this is what is already known. And this is what they have done to advance this knowledge. I would begin my peer review report by writing a brief note like that. And then is the background description adequate? Have they done a thorough review of the literature in this area? And is it adequate? I think this is crucial. And then I would go into the citation of the references, and I would like to see if they are all more recent references. If there is something on, say, somebody has written something on organ donation, the ethics of organ donation, a lot of advances in the ethics of organ donation has happened in the past 20 years. But if the references have been much older references, if there are references from the 1970s, 1980s, they may be important references, but if they are only old references without any catching up in the past 20 years, I would really request the authors to do more reading of recent references. Then are there any important references, landmark papers which have been missed out in the background? That is another important thing that I would look for. Two things which I have personally encountered, not very uncommon, is a lot of self-citation by authors. This happens especially when you have this open review process. I mean, if it is a single blinded peer review, where I know who the author is, but the authors do not get to know who the reviewers are. This is the style which we practice in the Indian Journal of Medical Ethics. It's a single blinded review. So sometimes we notice that authors tend to cite themselves a lot. As long as it is something which is relevant and useful for building the background work for the paper, that is good. But is it really relevant is something I would look for, and I would really write about it to the editor to let them know that there is something like this happening. Then are all the citations appropriate? Sometimes I've had situations where there is a citation and the author wouldn't have even read the full paper that they have cited. They would have cited it because the title is closely related to what they are writing on. So the context in which they have cited it and whether that citation really covers this context is something that it is too much to ask to go through all the citations. But if there is something which is glaring, if something looks like it does not fit into this, then it would be useful to go open that paper, read at least, quickly skim through that paper and see whether it is an appropriate citation. I think this will provide a reasonable confidence on the background and the literature review that has gone behind this manuscript. The second thing that a good peer review report will have is that it states the importance, relevance, and novelty of the research. Again, importance, relevance, and novelty are very subjective assessments that the reviewer has to make. But nevertheless, it is an assessment that the reviewer must make because the reviewer is an expert. They are an expert in the area and they have experience in that area, and therefore they have to help the editor by giving their reasonable subjective judgment on the importance, the relevance to the area, and the novelty. Again, novelty is not something which is purely the reason to reject a paper, to recommend rejection of a paper, because there could be different approaches to the same research area. There could be different approaches to the topic. But again, giving a recommendation to the editor based on the importance, relevance, and novelty of the research is a very important thing. But these need not be reasons for rejecting a paper. Just because it does not it's not new, it's not novel, it has been written about extensively in the past, that need not be a reason to reject, but a relative judgment on these three areas would be useful for the editor. Then the peer review report declares assessment of adherence to research reporting standards. There are specific standards for epidemiological, empirical research designs, epidemiological designs, qualitative research designs, then systematic reviews, scoping reviews. There are reporting standards. So a peer reviewer, it would be useful for a peer reviewer to go through these standards and see if the reporting of the research paper actually adheres to these reporting standards. They can specifically identify missing elements and ask for them in their peer review reports. These reporting standards ensure that the methodology section is reported in a manner that helps assess the rigor of the research. Then the peer review report should comment on the methodological rigor that is achieved. Critical appraisal, there are standard checklists available for various research designs. Again, like Angus said earlier, it's not enough if we just point out the omissions and commissions, the errors that are there in the paper, but provide a rationale, provide a justification for why we think these are inaccurate or these are not appropriate. And when something seems unclear, rather than giving a harsh critique, I think it is important to ask for clarifications. Because especially when these are papers from people from countries where they are not native English language speakers, where they are countries like papers that come from India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Iran. We have very good papers that come from Iran to the Indian Journal of Medical Ethics, but since they are not native English language speakers, some communication gap exists. Therefore, it would be useful to ask for clarifications rather than reject the papers, rather than recommend rejection of the papers just because something is unclear. Then the peer review report should comment on the results, their accuracy and precision. Are they according to standards of reporting? Like, for example, if it is an empirical paper using statistical methods, there are some standards of reporting p-values and confidence intervals and statistical results. So do they adhere to those results, to those standards? And then do the numbers really tally up? We have found oftentimes that there are big tables and the numbers in the columns and rows do not really add up. Sometimes percentages do not add up to 100. So these are all very important, and a peer reviewer can pick these up if they look at those tables. Then it is important to point out why. This is again, I'm reiterating what Angus said earlier. Generic comments like reanalyze the data analysis is not in depth, they are not useful. Reanalyze in what way? Like, for example, when there is a qualitative research report in which they have done a phenomenological study and they have reported various verbatim codes. And if the reviewer feels these verbatim codes do not accurately represent the themes under which they have been classified, they have to justify or explain why these do not fit under these themes and why they think a relook at the data would be useful. So I think giving a reasoning is very, very important when we are engaging with the results. Then the peer review report comments on usefulness of the discussion. The discussion section is probably the second most original section of the entire manuscript, because of course, the methods and the findings are the most original. But the most important contribution, according to me, is the discussion, because here the author reflect on their findings. They reflect on what they think is the meaning of what they found in their result. And they also say how this advances the existing knowledge, and how this can move forward, how further research can take this forward. And I think that section, if it has to be a useful contribution, then it should have interpretations, it should have implications of what the finding actually mean. Then it should also have a statement of strengths and limitations. I think that reflects on the humility on the part of the authors when they declare these are the limitations of our study, and these are the things that we couldn't achieve, and future studies could probably cover those and achieve those. Then a good peer review report also provides opinion on research ethics. I think Sabrina will be covering some aspects of this, but a good peer review report should also say whether the ethics review obtained is appropriate, whether the informed consent process has been good. It is not uncommon to find manuscripts submitted, especially from low income, low middle income countries where no ethics review has happened on studies involving human participants. That is because either an ethics committee does not exist in the institution, or an ethics committee does not exist anywhere in the nearby vicinity of that place where the research is happening. So in those situations, it is important to see whether an ethics review process has been declared, whether it is done according to the standards, Declaration of Helsinki, or any of the standard ethical guidelines. And then, are there any conflicts of interest? These are things which a peer reviewer can reflect on. Is there a conflict between the funders and the researchers? Those things they can reflect on. Is there a possibility of plagiarism? I have once had an experience where huge sections of my paper was plagiarized in another manuscript that I had received. So I could easily identify it. So I think that is an extremely rare phenomenon, may not happen to every reviewer, but I think if you can keep your eyes and ears open for that kind of plagiarism, that will be useful to pick up and share with the editor. It doesn't make decline decisions. The peer review report does not make decline decisions purely based on what information is provided about the ethics of the paper. Because, like I said, the paper might have come from, recently we had a paper from an African country where the authors declared that they do not have a ethics committee in their institution or in their neighborhood. And therefore, we had to take a different stand on whether we should reject such a paper for lack of having a ethics review. There are many journals provide an option to provide a confidential comments to the editor, which the authors will not have access to. This would be a space where you can actually say, I think there is plagiarism. I think there is some conflict of interest. I think ethics review is inadequate. Those kinds of comments can go directly to the editor, and the editor can take an action regarding how they want to handle these kinds of ethical breaches. Then the review report provides opinion on language and style. But again, like Angus pointed out earlier, doing a copy editing is not the job of the peer reviewer. I mean, commenting on the grammar, commenting on the spelling mistakes, I think that's too much. And it cannot be a reason for rejecting a paper. And again, the other important thing is the style of writing. I have had of my own paper, I have had a peer review of my paper in which the reviewer had asked me to change the style in which I had reported a qualitative finding. When we are reporting a phenomenological report, it is very important to write in a first-person narrative. We write like how we were there in the site of the interview and what we experienced while we were talking to the interviewer. But this reviewer probably, I don't know who the reviewer is, but this reviewer probably comes from a very positivist background. And therefore, she gave me a report saying you have to change it to not a first person narrative. It should be a third person narrative. And I think those kinds of stylistic reviews I think it can be an advice, but it cannot be a very strong recommendation, because there are many styles of writing research papers, especially qualitative research papers. And the review report provides clear recommendations on acceptance, revisions, decline, and many journals now have these editorial managers who give you these drop-down options. Whether it is a right away accept, or accept with minor changes, accept with major modifications, or review after major modifications, decline right away. Taking this stand, I think, is a very useful step. It is very important. We have to take the stand and we have to advise the editor. The editor may not go with our decision every single time, but they will find it useful to look at what we recommend with respect to the paper. When it comes to ethics papers, one thing I have noticed is sometimes there are comments and commentaries which get submitted where we have ideological disagreements with the arguments that are made. But that does not mean we have to reject it. That does not mean we have to recommend rejection. We have to just look at the whole argument of the paper, look at the coherence of the argument, look at the points and support, and then sometimes based on our review report, the editor themselves can ask us to write a commentary on the paper that gets published. That has also happened to me many times, where there has been a paper I have strongly had opposing arguments. So I have submitted them in my peer review, and my editor has called me to do a accompanying commentary along with the paper. And those kinds of things can also happen. And therefore, giving good arguments in the peer review report, especially in comments and commentaries, becomes very important. Then, of course, like Angus said, it has to be polite, constructive, timely, and it has to be well organized. One good thing to do would be to organize the comments into major and minor comments, where the major comments are those which must be addressed, and the minor ones are things like spelling, grammar, sentence number 73 has this typographical error, and things like that. And of course, like Angus said, timing is everything, and it is very important. And if we need more time, we should ask for more time. So those are some of the 10 aspects I think are aspects of a good peer review. And these are some, Sanjay Pai, one of the co-editors along with me in Indian Journal of Medical Ethics, has written a beautiful paper called How to Referee a Paper and Save the World. He takes a very interesting stand on that. I would recommend all of you to read that paper. And COPE has interesting guidelines. And these are my references. And that would be me.
Thank you so much, Vijay. It's like so much of thoroughness in a way where I have so many questions at the same time, with especially the disciplinary perspectives and how the peer review reports when they write, right, and how do they engage. But I'll hold off my questions. But is there any questions from the audience? One question, and then we can move to the next speaker. Okay.
Hello.
Yes. Hi, Irene.
Hi.
How are you?
I was just wondering, because some of us from when we started our research careers, ethics review committees used to be something we feel like to be scared about. It's like a policing kind of activity when you have a proposal you're submitting for ethical review. So we've not had much experience with in terms of peer review as reviewers, but we've had experience of having articles reviewed. And sometimes you get comments which you feel like, oh, there's a human being behind all this. And then sometimes you get comments and they're like, oh my God, did this person wake up on the wrong side of the bed? So we are trying to move away from fearing ethics review committees and also from fearing reviewers. And maybe they can say something about that.
Yeah, so that fear of addressing the ethics committee, fear of that's a universal, I think it's a universal feeling all researchers have. We have this feeling of having to go and stand in front of the ethics committee and answering those questions. But I think it is an important thing because some of the criticism and some of the inputs that an ethics committee gives definitely go a long way in improving the quality of our papers, as well as ensuring that our research participants are protected. So, but that anxiety, I think, is eustress. It's a very important stress to have, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll definitely talk more after next speaker's talk and continue this conversation, yeah? So we have Sabrina, next speaker, Dr. Sabrina Germain. I'm sorry if I butchered your second name.
Absolutely fine.
Oh, thank you. Is a reader in healthcare law and policy and the Associate Dean for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at City Law School. She's also a member of City University Center for Healthcare Innovation Research, the co-lead of Health and Equity Lab, and the member of Medical Law Review Editorial Advisory Board. And her research calls attention to the importance of justice, especially within the healthcare law and policy. So check out her works. Sabrina will talk about ethics in peer review and identifying conflicts of interest from author's perspective. Sabrina, over to you.
Thank you very much. I will just share my screen now. I hope everybody can see it.
Not yet.
Can you see it now?
Not, yes. Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, so thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to meet all of you and to be here to chat a little bit more about conflict of interest in publishing. So as mentioned, an associate professor in healthcare law and policy, and in January 2024, I had the pleasure to join the editorial advisory board of the Medical Law Review, which is the leading health law journal in the UK. So I also want to make some representations here. I'm not speaking in my capacity as board member today, but in my own name. But I think some of the examples that I have, you might find useful from that particular experience and in some other capacities where I had to use my position and understand what conflicts of interest is. So for my presentation, Supriya has asked me to focus on conflict of interest from an author's and early career researcher perspective. So this is what I will do. But first, I wanted to generally define what is a conflict of interest in the context of publication more broadly, and how it can affect many parts of the publication process and beyond. Then I will give you some striking examples to help you identify potential conflict of interest when it comes to your own publication. And finally, I wanted to discuss some of the dilemmas and more gray areas and provide you with some practical steps on how to avoid a conflict of interest altogether. So very simply, I think a conflict of interest can be defined as an interest that might bias someone's work. But when we look at it in the context of publishing, this is something that may affect the work of various stakeholders and can have a very detrimental impact on the quality of the publication. It can also have a very detrimental impact on someone's career, the integrity of science or social science more broadly. So in fact, none of the actors in the publishing process are immune to conflict of interest, and that's important to understand. Starting with the editors, it is possible to imagine situations where editors that assume the very vital role, as Angus explained, of gatekeeping for their journal may be influenced by some of their interests. Of course, we always want to assume that people adhere to professionalism, especially in that role, but we're all humans. Editors are the first point of call, and they decide whether or not the publication will altogether go to peer reviewers. And this is why we are often, as authors, looking at the rates of desk rejects from some journals. And especially in law, we're very keen on sharing this information and either staying away from those journals or being triumphant when we get through that first step. But this first step is very much essential to the process, and it's important that it remains impartial, not to compromise the quality of the journal and the science altogether. The editors are also responsible for selecting peer reviewers, and in this process too, we see, as Sanjay explained, that the other conflict of interest can arise, either because the same reviewers are always called on, because there's very few experts in the field, or reviewers more easily agree to review paper than others. So they tend to be called on more. So because the editor might have a special relationship with a peer reviewer or an author, they might also be influenced to get someone to do that peer review for them, depending on whether or not they want a more or less favorable review. But we would hope that this is not the case. So editors should not let the bias swoop in making the final call as well on whether or not to include the publication in their next issue. So that's from an editor's standpoint. So as explained, peer reviewers, for their part, evaluate the quality, rigor, and originality of the research. And in order for them to accomplish this role effectively, they need to feedback in an unbiased way. So it is not because the peer review is blind that it is immune from a conflict of interest. The conflict, as I just explained, can arise from the relationship the peer reviewer has with the editor. And it can also happen that the expertise in a specific field is very limited and peer reviewers can work out who the author is, as we've discussed earlier. So it's difficult in those circumstances to remain very much objective. Finally, of course, the author, this will be the focus of the remainder of my presentation, but I wanted to flag right off the bat that there is possibility of conflict in some situations for the authors themselves. So why does this matter? Well, the integrity of peer review process is fundamental to the advancement of our knowledge, the credibility of our research, and when conflict of interest is not properly managed, it can also lead to biased reviews, unfair assessments, and ultimately a flawed and unreliable publication. So even the mere perception of a conflict is enough to damage the reputation of a researcher and a reviewer and also the journal involved. So here I wanted to offer you a few examples of situations that give rise to conflict of interest. And there are more than the ones that I've listed, but this is just to give you kind of a flavor for what it is. So regarding financial interest, conflict of interest may arise when the funding of research comes from a source that can benefit from a specific research outcome. So for example, you're conducting a research in healthcare policy on end-of-life care, and part of your funding comes from a private healthcare company that profits from hospice care services. So even if the company does not directly influence the research, the financial connection could raise some concern about the objectivity of your conclusion. And this, especially if your result align with the company's interest. On the other hand, you could have your institution itself that has the ties to organization that may benefit from your research. Of course, right off the bat, I'm based in the UK at the moment, so I can think obviously of the University of Cambridge and the close tie it has to pharmaceutical companies. For example, we've seen the collaboration during the pandemic with AstraZeneca. The partnership may benefit the company by allowing them to access the cutting-edge research of the university. But on the flip side, also, the university accesses cutting-edge facilities from the company. I'm not implying here that there's a conflict of interest between the University of Cambridge and AstraZeneca, to the contrary. But it is important that we keep this on our radar when we review the research or when we take part in research, because there needs to be a clear declaration on those links. Personal relationships happen. We're humans, we interact, we have friends and family, and sometimes friends and family can be involved from various standpoints in our research. And we can see this as membership of editorial boards, having some friends and colleagues that are part of the editorial board where we submit a paper. We can also think of situations where husband and wives, for example, work together on research projects. Some partners do work together. And more often than not, this is really not an issue. However, things become a bit more complicated when we ask a friend to act as a peer reviewer, for example, for an edited collection, which has happened for me. Same when we are asked to review articles for a prize. So I was the trustee on the Society of Legal Studies Association, the SLSA, and I've been asked to review articles and declare any relationships I may have had. And it becomes a little bit complicated when you're in the limited field of socio-legal studies, not to rig the vote, because you are either working on a project, have worked on a project, or are friends with some of the people nominated. But all of this needs to obviously be properly declared. And then we've touched on this a little bit earlier. There's intellectual bias. The researcher is sometimes deeply committed to a specific theoretical or ethical perspective, and that may skew the evidence or the theory that they present in their research. And that is a form of conflict of interest. Of course, we all have our views of the world, and we see them through specific prisms. Particularly, we're mostly favorable to the theories or approaches of someone that has taught us, for example. So it's important to recognize this and not to be prejudiced to other approaches. Here we see this as an issue with regards to sensibilities. I would say I'm most familiar with something that I work on is reproductive health and the different stances around abortion or gender diversity issues. And then that can lead to some clashes around the reviewing when some people just simply don't agree with some moral or ethical stance from the author. There's also academic rivalries. We mentioned this. Personal competition with other researchers may influence how they evaluate your work or you evaluate their work, whether or not as well you want to submit to their journal if you know they're part of the editorial board. So academia is a very small community, and often we have across our social settings come to encounter people at conferences and the editors of journals even. And we may have had a very pleasant experience or a very unpleasant experience or encounter. And this will obviously impact whether or not we want to submit to a journal or we want to evaluate a peer's publication. Of course, we're talking about blind peer reviewing, but sometimes they are not blind, or sometimes we can guess who has written a paper, and this will influence how we evaluate it. But bear in mind, if you do know who you are reviewing, and maybe you're not so keen on the person, that if you have a negative bias towards them, they might also have a negative bias towards you. So you might not want to put out there this negative energy if you don't want to receive it back. So I think we should all try to do our level best to remain very professional and objective and not to let our personal views get in the way. So more specifically, for early career researchers, there might be some gray areas of conflict of interest where situations that are not clearly violating ethical standards can raise some concern about potential bias. And these are quite subtle and they're harder to define, and sometimes they're even overlooked because they don't involve direct financial or personal gain. So I thought I would give you a few examples of these. One of them, I think one of the most interesting one, in my opinion, is gift authorship. So sometimes you have a senior or more established colleague that might want to be added as your co-author on the paper, either because they think it's going to help you get a foot in the door of a journal, or simply because you're part of their bigger research team and they just feel like that's part of their bigger research project. So it is not a clear violation of conflict of interest, but if the contribution from that colleague is very minimal, perhaps they should not be included in the publication. So here it is a boundary between the legitimate co-authorship and the gift authorship that can be unclear, especially when it comes to the publication of doctoral students' work. Another one that is a bit blurry is the funding that we receive. And most oftentimes we receive funding from public or nonprofit sources. And receiving grants from a nonprofit or government agency can create some bias, particularly if the funding has a specific agenda. Because nonprofit or public funding is common, and it is likely that we will overlook this as a potential influence, but it may influence how we direct our research to be angled in kind of the line of the sponsor's direction. So something to be aware of, but obviously we all need funds to conduct our research. We should just only be mindful of this and keep ourselves in check. With regards to mentoring, early career researchers tend to rely on senior colleagues for collaboration and opportunity, but also for the funding and their networks. And this might lead to some bias when it comes to publishing with a mentor. So the mentor-mentee relationship is quite essential in academia, but it can sometimes blur the lines. And I think we need to be mindful. We need to keep ourselves also in check to make sure that we produce the best research and we're not just agreeing with whatever our mentor is giving us as a line. Self-citation, we've mentioned this a little bit before. Citing your own work, of course, can boost your citation metrics and your profile, but doing it excessively or inappropriately can be very problematic. So the citation must be obviously a good illustration or support for the argument you're putting forward, not just included to increase your H-index. Special issues are an interesting one as well. You have been or will be invited to contribute to a journal's special issue for a guest editor that you know or even admire. And this creates some pressure to align with the research or the theme presented in the issue. And this is a very gray area one. Something we all will face. So special issues are common and they're very prestigious. And even though they blur objectivity when it comes to their connection and the topic, we need to be mindful of this. Although we want to align with the topic of the special issue, we want to make sure that we're not just aligning our argument to what we think the editor would want us to publish. So very briefly, to finish, I wanted to give you a few tips on how to avoid the conflicts of interest or to deal with them. So I think transparency is always the best policy. I would always suggest erring on the side of cautions and disclosing a potential conflict. So this is something to me that happened last year. I was asked to review a paper. Of course, I'm one of few experts on health inequalities in the UK and distributive justice. So I knew very well who that paper was from because I had attended a seminar where this was a work in progress paper. So I tried to put that bias to the side, but I have mentioned it to the editor. But I was asked to review that paper again. So I gave a decision for the first paper and it was ultimately rejected. And then a second journal approached me to review that paper again. And then I had to obviously disclose to the editor-in-chief that I had been reviewing this paper before. What's interesting here, and I must say, is that you need to be able to abstract yourself. So the editor asked me, do you think you can be objective enough? And I thought I could be. So that was a revised version of the paper. I evaluated the paper as if it was a new paper that I had never read before. And to my surprise, my decision completely has changed because it was much better suited to a specialized paper than the first journal that it was submitted to. So we should hope that reviewers can adopt that kind of detachment from reviewing some papers that they're being presented with multiple times. So publication and institutional policies need to be looked at before engaging in any further funding application or submitting a piece of work to a journal. It's important to read the policy on conflict of interest. I would advise doing that right off the bat. As you have now learned, there are some gray areas and each institution treats them very differently and funders as well. Also, what needs to be done sometimes is a recusal. Sometimes you will have to decline to review or to take part in a project where you might be conflicted. It's very frustrating to do that and pass on an opportunity. I don't like that myself, but we should always remember that it is important to preserve our integrity, and that will preserve your reputation as a researcher as well. Finally, I would encourage you to engage in discussion with your peers and mentors about potentially ambiguous cases to gain a little bit of perspective and insight. Sometimes I'm reading the conflict of interest statement or policy of a journal and I'm not entirely sure that I, don't fall within. I would call on a colleague that has published in that journal and just double check with them if they think I do have a conflict of interest. And if I'm still unsure, I can contact the editor-in-chief before submitting. So I would say that that's the best way to deal with these type of issues. But you can also consult the guidance from the UK Committee on Publication and Ethics that was mentioned earlier, the COPE, and that gives you a very detailed explanation and multiple ways in which you can handle a potential conflict of interest. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. It was really so much to unpack, and I think already the questions have started coming through here. Do you want to start responding to the question? We have Alma. Some funders required to publish only with a supervisor. That is especially looking at example of postdoc or supervisor, no other co-authors. How do you mitigate conflict of interest in such situations as an author?
I think it's a difficult one. And I think especially for early career researcher, there is pressure to kind of align and publish with the supervisor. If it's a requirement, it has to be done. But also I think there needs to be a very clear, I come from a field that's very different in law. So we have Our second and first author and last author are very different than in other disciplines, but the place of authorship has to be discussed. So I would say, for example, I published recently with a much more senior colleague than me and somebody that's very established in my field, and we had a very open discussion on who would be the first author or second author of the paper. Sometimes this is not up for grabs, it is not up for discussion, but I think that this is something that we should try to unpack more and more. But I know that a lot of times with regards to the doctoral supervisor, this is not something that can be really up for discussion. But if it's a requirement, you have to meet it. Unfortunately, there's not much that can be done. But for future publication, I would say it's always good with the co-author to have a very open conversation before publishing.
Yeah, thank you. And so much of power asymmetries when it comes in different contexts, and which adds on to more of a difficult, how do we talk openly about this, right? But yeah, thank you. So we have solid now almost 35 minutes. So this is great to talk more from all the speakers. First of all, thank you so much for all the speakers to share your experience and perspectives, and also to share like step-by-step process of how peer review can be done in a way which have the reciprocity as the center, at the same time acknowledging that how knowledge production world is very small. And inevitably, we end up bumping into each other if we stick together in a way in the space. And it's challenges definitely as we read and engage with others' works. So feel free to take a moment and keep thinking the questions you have for our panelists here, for our speakers. But maybe before someone asks, maybe I'll start some questions to you all. So given the multidisciplinarity, sometimes I wonder whether even to use multidisciplinarity or post-disciplinarity, like especially looking at the discipline like bioethics or like global health ethics, all the public, all the ethics, let's say if I put it into applied ethics context. When you are thinking about peer reviewing, and also as an editor, because all of you are working as an editors, right? Do you see a struggle of peer reviews, like from different disciplinary perspectives, pushing in and nudging the ways authors should think and write? I think you already have touched here and there, especially Vijay did, and even Angus did. Do you want to elaborate more, or how, as a peer reviewer, early career researchers, when they peer review, how we can make sure that, hey, this is what I come from because of the training or disciplinary position, and then do a better job at peer reviewing? Any ideas, thoughts, or tips more?
I'm trying to think of ways of improving on my colleague's answer. I think they were quite complete, but I think it's important to acknowledge your own limitations. So, for example, I'm asked to review outside of my field very frequently, and there's a lot of comments I cannot make with regards to methods. I'm simply not trained in them, and that's just not what I know. I think it's very important to signal to the editor. So you've been called on because obviously they think that you have an expertise in a certain area, but I think it's important to be quite transparent about the fact that you have certain limitations and you cannot comment on certain aspect of the paper, because otherwise either the editor will think there's not a problem there, or maybe that you just ignore that aspect. But I'm very clear when I put out the review that this is my limitation and my own expertise. That doesn't mean that this is the author's limitation. On the contrary, when there's something that is flagged up that might not be obvious in the discipline where I review, especially around language, because being a lawyer, this is very important. I often comment on the use of certain words because they are used interchangeably for other disciplines, but not in mine. So I make a note of that, but I make sure that I provide a reference to say, this is not just a stylistic comment. This is why I believe this is very important to change that word, for example, to capitalize the word black. So I will provide a link and a reference to explain why. And I think that may be helpful to some. So I've been reviewing for some journals that provide also feedback to the reviewers afterwards. And so they give you the comments from the authors when they've received your review. And some of them have acknowledged that that was very beneficial because they encountered sources that they were not being familiar with because of their own discipline. So that's something that I think can be helpful. It's beneficial for the reviewers, for the authors. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I really like that as an opportunity, like, because many times I really love the way the peer reviews have helped me construct and learn better. And I really want to respond back, and hopefully the editors can send back those questions. But yeah, that's a good way to think about. We have a question from Swaleha on chat, and then we will take Iren's question. Swaleha said, what about the issue of over citations in manuscripts. Sometimes there are so many citations, around 80 to 90. How does one deal with that? Anyone wants to respond?
I think journals usually have a restriction on the number of citations for different types of submissions. Like for an original article, they may ask you to restrict yourself to 20 to 30 citations. For systematic reviews, they may give you allowance to do up to 70, 80 citations. And I think it goes like that. And when there are too many citations, I think one needs to just see whether they are all necessary ones, appropriate ones, how many of them are self-citations, and then which of these can be trimmed out. Like if there are some more recent citations and the old ones are just there because they are there, not contributing much, then I think we can suggest as reviewers that retain these because they are more relevant and trim out the other ones.
Great, thank you. Anyone else wants to add?
I was going to say something about citation practices can be disciplinary specific, and philosophy lies at one extreme. There tends to be like less of an interest in actually making the effort to look at the literature on a particular topic before beginning work in that particular area. This is this really struck me during COVID, as somebody who'd been writing about, for example, vaccinations for 20 years. Suddenly, all these people discovered that vaccination was an issue and then started writing papers, and they didn't bother to actually read any of the previous literature on this. So we had a lot of desk rejections for our journal because of people submitting papers that were just not aware of the previous literature. At the other extreme are some disciplines, such as nursing, that have a practice of almost wanting a citation after every single sentence. And I was once asked by some students who were given the task of submitting an essay, and they said, how many citations should I have? And I just looked at them sort of blankly at first because I didn't really understand what they were asking. And so I said, well, as many as you need. There's no kind of set number, but it turned out that they had come from a tradition where there was a certain kind of expectation that a certain number of words required a certain number of citations. And I said, oh, well, in ethics work, it's only if you were making an empirical claim, you might have a citation, or if you had a particular view that was contested, then you might outline why there were different perspectives on the issue and give some representative citations for particular views and so on. So I think it's very interesting working in a interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, post-disciplinary area of activity, that we will, as reviewers, come across these different traditions in the papers that we see presented. And I think what's important is to accept that there are different citation practices. And what's most important, I think, is that the citations are relevant to the work that's being produced, and that somebody is not just making a claim with no citation when they are saying something, for example, making an empirical claim about something being effective. Well, I'd like to see some evidence of effectiveness, and that's most likely going to be a citation. Whereas if they are, for example, making a moral claim about their own particular views, I don't need to see a citation for that. If they are saying there are 3 key accounts of ideas about harm in the literature, then I would want to see some citations for that. So I think it's going to be context dependent and paper dependent, but very important, disciplinary dependent. Philosophy, as I mentioned before, is like one extreme, and sometimes it can be really strange when you get a paper and it just has 6 references. But it can also be really irritating, as the questioner is suggesting, when you have like hundreds and hundreds of pages and pages of citations in the bibliography, because then things just get lost in the mass of material.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you so much, Angus. Irene?
Okay, my question is in relation to how reviewers deal with maybe something new in methodology, for example, because I was reading a paper just this week and it was very interesting, an ethics paper, a bioethics paper, and it was a systematic review. And I know we have this, a lot of decolonization discourse going on within bioethics. And this article was done in Australia, and it was done amongst, some research was done amongst the First Nations people. And even as a systematic review, it was done in a partnership with the community. Everything that was being written about in terms of the results of the systematic review, everything was verified together with the First Peoples Nation, even on articles that were picked on the search, I mean, what the words meant and what the results meant for the First Peoples Nations. It was the first time I was seeing such a thing, but also there was a lot of things they mentioned on decolonization practices. For example, of course, we know part of it being systematic reviews are being given too much dominance or too much superiority in quotes. So in their way of saying we reduce the superiority of systematic review by either missing the step on quality appraisal of the results, of the search results, and of the articles that were retrieved at that time. And there was a lot of other comments on decolonial practices that went on even in the process of a systematic review. So it's really interesting to see that a lot is coming up in terms of methodologies, and I don't know how even reviewers deal with all that.
Right. Yeah. Any comment?
Yeah, I think I think it's a very interesting comment. I'm currently taking part in a funding application with Canada, and we have now requirements to involve First Nations in the design of any study that will pertain to them or touch them directly or indirectly, and then that's now becoming a requirement of co-creation. And I part of another study in the UK where that was a requirement from the funder to co-create the study in partnership with the research population that we're studying. So I think that is essential. I think it's important to construct impactful research. And I think that more and more, because the funders are putting this as a requirement, I would hope that the editors and the reviewers would follow suit and just actually acknowledge that this is quite beneficial for our research. But I can see a shift, exactly what you're talking about, in the co-creation aspect and co-design of studies. And I find that quite interesting and important.
Thank you. So there is another question from Irene. In the absence of conflict of interest, is there any obligation to accept a peer review request, especially from journals without explicit statement on providing certificates to reviewers for self-use on platforms such as Publon? Any thoughts?
I don't think you're ever under an obligation to accept a request. At least a specific request, particularly if there is a conflict of interest or even if there isn't. So, for example, if you've reviewed 6 papers this month, I think you've fulfilled any reciprocal obligations. So I think it's I do think there's a overall obligation to participate in reviewing, but it's never going to be specific to a particular request.
Great. Right. Any other questions? Meanwhile, I'll just ask a question. What do you think about do peer reviewers can tell to editor that about co-authorship? Like, for example, if you see a qualitative research and there are almost 10 authors, but then the study is done by PhD student, then how do like for me, like it's like, and it's also almost like the I is the important narrative which is coming through, but then they've used we just to replace I with we. And then there is written. And then I feel like very painful to see this. And is it as a peer reviewer, I feel it's my obligation to tell the editor, but is it editor who has already should have done this cross check? How does this work? I mean, I'm curious to hear from you all.
I've seen something very interesting the other day. I was looking to where one of the papers that we're co-authoring should be going to. So we were like looking at different journals outside of our discipline. All of us were all lawyers, and we of course looked at the Lancet, and then they have actually now made a note in their guidance and saying, if there are more than 3, we will not accept, because we don't believe that there can be that many authors on a paper. So that make a meaningful contribution. So I think that's quite interesting to see that shift. This is something very uncommon in law. So you have more than 3, it will raise a lot of suspicion. We don't have more than 3 typically. But I think this is something that I would, if it came to my discipline, obviously this is something that we would be flagging because this is very unusual. But I know in the sciences, this is not something that's atypical. So that's the comment I can offer from the law standpoint.
Yeah, thanks. Anyone else wants to respond? Yeah.
I think it is disciplinary specific, but this is touching on one of my favorite topics. I could easily go into a long rant about this. I think bioethics, because of its nature, this is a very hotly contested issue. And what actually counts as authorship is something that I think is changing. And a lot of the early work in bioethics was very often coming from more of a humanities tradition, which was more similar to the legal tradition in terms of thinking about authorship as being something substantively bound up with the actual writing. Whereas increasingly, I find the notion of authorship is shifting more in the direction of a medical notion or a scientific notion of authorship. And I'm somebody who really wants to hold on to that more humanities-based idea of authorship. And I think it's a tension which is, certainly it exists in our center in terms of, and I think it exists within the discipline, if or the field or whatever bioethics actually is. What actually counts as authorship is now highly contested. And one of the things that made me aware of this was that I recently went back and I tracked the number of authors on papers that are published in our journal since 2008. And the numbers of authors goes up like this. And I think that's part of a general trend. And I think what's actually changed, I don't think there's probably much change in terms of who's actually done the work. It's other kinds of people that are being counted as authors. And I frequently raise questions with the authors of papers that are submitted to our journal. And we ask if there's more than 2 or 3 authors, we ask specifically, tell us what each person has actually done. So we are trying to hold authors to be accountable, at least partly because I'm extremely worried that more junior colleagues are essentially being exploited by more senior people or people that have been the kind of names on a grant, but have actually not contributed to a particular paper, but they have expectations to actually be considered to be an author. So what we're doing here is asking some questions. And it happens frequently that we get a paper that has 10 authors on, and then I ask the question, what has everybody done? And then in the revised paper, it comes out that there are then 2 or 3 authors that are submitted at that stage. So I think some people, because of the pressure that everybody's under to publish and to publish more, there's a temptation to, for example, within a research team or a department in a university, to have an agreement that everybody goes on as an author. And what you need to do as part of the editorial process is to kind of push back a bit on that and sort of raise the question, tell us exactly what you have actually contributed to this paper. Of course, in some cases, it can be perfectly legitimate to have more than 3 authors because, for example, you're doing some comparative empirical work and the field workers have expertise in particular language, or you're looking at different nation states and making comparisons there. So you have part of an international team that have people involved. So just being clear what is actually being considered as being the kind of warrant that somebody has to be considered an author is really important. And just being the senior person that happened to walk past the door at the moment that somebody pressed the submission of the paper, or reading a paper and correcting a few typos and so on, these are the things that don't count as authorship. And you know, I say to many of my colleagues, make myself a little bit unpopular. I frequently read papers by more junior colleagues. I make comments on them, and I say, I would be upset if you don't acknowledge me in the paper, but I don't want to be an author. I don't think I count as being an author because you've done the work. You know, what I have done is equivalent really to being a reviewer. So I think it's really great to thank reviewers when they have really helped you with your paper, but they don't count as authors. And it's just the same with more senior people. I think too many senior people, in my view, now have an expectation if they say anything about a paper, then they count as being an author. And I personally want to push back on that. I have never, ever published with any of my PhD students, and I think I've now had 18 of them that have successfully completed, except where we have jointly written something which is separate from their actual project. And again, this is really important because I think we face another problem where there's lots of joint publication, which is when somebody has a PhD, I, as somebody who might offer that person a job, I want to know that they can actually do independent research. And we take a PhD as being symbolic of the fact that somebody can do independent research. But if all of the publications that have gone into that PhD are then multi-authored, I have no idea what contribution that particular person has made to that body of work. So I think it's something to really watch out for, that publication practices could actually disadvantage you when it comes to seeking further employment. Because if I see a lot of co-authored papers, particularly if the person themselves is not first author on those papers, I'm going to just assume that there has been much less contribution to the publication itself. So authorship practices, I think, are, sorry, I did actually end up going into a rant, didn't I? But authorship practices really are hotly contested, and I just see more opportunity for dispute here. Particularly, I find it really annoying how more junior colleagues are, people at the beginning of their careers, are open to exploitation by more senior people.
Thanks, Angus. I mean, I really appreciate that. Like, and to talk about those issues, especially for early career researchers, how do we navigate and how do we push back, right? And then also find our identity and also voice, while also acknowledging that we need to collaborate. So there is this tension. On one hand, we need to show we are collaborators, like authentic collaborators. On the other hand, we need to find our niche and find our identity in this academic space. And yeah, there's so much to, maybe we should have another webinar on that. Okay, Swaleha?
Okay, so this is the other Swaleha. My name is
Hi.
But Swaleha decided that it's her name that should go on the screen, so that's fine. So,
no, because I registered. No one else bothered to register.
okay, so there's another coming up. So I had a comment related to what Angus was talking about, and actually he just spoke a little bit about what I wanted to talk about. So we have a lot of gift authorship and coerced authorship practices in our part of the world, which is just it's norm. However, at our center over here, we've actually done the reverse of what Angus was talking about. When we supervise our master students, we make sure that we are never ever on the authorship when they publish. And that is where our graduates, the master's graduates, have a problem with that. They say that if you deprive us of having your name, then we do not get published. So our chances of getting published are less. We are intellectually committed to the project from the word go. In fact, we are convinced that we put in more hours in their theses than they do themselves. There's no question about that. The faculty is putting in more hours, more effort in everything from the conception to the methodology to actually, they may be collecting the data, but then they're presenting the data to us as it progresses till the final point when it goes out to the external reviewers for their assessment. But we fulfill every criteria in the book for authorship. However, we insist on not being the authors, and our students are upset with that. And this happens with every single academic cycle with us, and we are adamant that no, our bar is set here, and this is where it will remain. So that's I just wanted to throw this interesting, different dilemma for us.
Yeah, thanks there. I think, yeah, my immediate thing is it's okay if they're upset. but maybe I'm very cruel here, I feel, because that's where the conversation of how do we think about knowledge and how we think about, yeah, conversation within this academia. But at the same time, academia has gatekeeping, right? And I think that's what you're touching upon, like who gets into the door of like which journals. I mean, so much of unpacking needs to be done there of how gatekeeping functions. Please, anyone want to pick on that? Any of the speakers?
Well, I think I have a lot to say about this because in our discipline, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of who do you publish with? So generally, we single author papers, and that's kind of the tradition. And more and more, we're shifting to co-authorship because we want to do interdisciplinary work. But there's a lot of benefit, exactly like your student mentioned. For example, you're editing a book with a very established professor in ethics, for example, that would give you some sort of aura or clout. And then when you present a paper to a journal that's more highly ranked, then they will say, well, this person has published or has done a project with so and so. So there's more chances. So it's about almost a networking opportunity. I would say with regards, so we have a hierarchy of outputs that I think like every discipline. So for us, monographs are very highly ranked, and then edited collection and chapters are at the bottom of the food chain. But what people tend to do strategically, they will try to co-author, for example, a chapter with somebody more established, but generally the more established person is not necessarily interested in doing chapters because they want a peer-reviewed journal article or monograph. But that's kind of a form of networking that has developed in law, but that's more recent because before you had to do the name for yourself and you have to single author. But we see as you go up the academic ladder that you published more and more easily in a way. Of course, publishing attracts publishing, but there's also kind of something attached to, the rank that you have in the institution. So I totally understand why they would have a problem with the fact that they would want somebody to get them the foot in the door with their networks to try to get into more highly ranked journals. But at the same time, I totally understand your standpoint. And I think that's the right thing to do, is to not put yourselves as an author if you want them to develop and grow their own career. But I understand the point they're making.
Yeah, now there is this question, which is like, I'm going to open the door. It's like a box there. So the question on the chat is, we have not discussed the elephant in the room, AI. Is there anything as a reviewer we should now be looking out for in terms of the contribution of AI in writing papers? Is there conflict in using AI in your experience? What might be acceptable? There is so much to talk. Do we have time, I feel? But please, anyone wants to just take a dig at this?
I think it is really complicated, and it's a big issue facing journals now, particularly related to this idea of what counts as authorship. So you have some people who are real advocates for AI, and they basically say, well, I use AI in writing my papers, but all that it does is take material and present it in a particular way, and I'm still the key author because it's my paper and I put in the key ideas and I did the programming and that kind of thought. But old-fashioned people like me, I never really think of myself as being a social conservative, but on some things I seem to be. So people like me that think that's again not the core of what counts as authorship, that somebody needs to take responsibility, not just in terms of a procedural sign-off, in terms of saying, I am the author of this paper, so I take responsibility for the content, but that they must have authentically contributed to the construction of the paper itself. But I think we're going to see disagreements in the field across the body of whole journals. Where AI is used as a source of plagiarism, then it's much easier to see that as being a problem, because some of the existing plagiarism search tools will be able to detect that. So when there's just been reassembly of previously published ideas, then that'll probably be picked up. But it's this more creative use of AI that I think people just disagree about. What constitutes authorship again? I think we're into another set of disputes about what's important. And I think different journals are going to have different policies. And I think, again, the pressure is going to be on to just accept more and more over time.
Great, thank you. So are there any other questions or thoughts, comments?
I'm just surprised at the skewness in terms of where people publish bioethics related work. I'm seeing BMC medical ethics, for example, as a big percentage in terms. Okay, I'm doing a systematic review, and I'm seeing a very, very big percentage of publications coming from BMC medical ethics, and I'm like, there are all these other ethics related publications. Why is this the case? What happens to the journals that have more publications, and what happens to those that don't have majority of the publications? I'm just wondering why that's skew.
So I think you're touching on different kinds of models of how journals operate. So BMC Medical Ethics is an open access journal, which basically just means that the authors pay rather than the consumer pays. So the old traditional method of journal publication models were more the consumer, which in most cases meant university libraries paid for the journal themselves. So there are different economic models for how journals operate. There are some journals, like Indian Journal of Medical Ethics, for example, that operate on a different basis, again, with support from communities and so on, relying a lot upon people doing voluntary contributions and so on. So different journals have different means of operating, and I think it's important to know that. Personally, I'm a little bit concerned about the rush that there has been to open access journals, particularly those that are completely open access, because essentially there is a conflict of interest there for the journals to just take more and more papers and to expand. So it's interesting your comment about BMC Medical Ethics. Personally, I worry about that potential conflict of interest that there is on essentially a more commercial model, rather than saying, we have 3 issues a year and each of them has 8 to 10 papers. It's a model in which you can have infinite numbers of papers, and the temptation is to always take a paper that's been submitted if the authors are willing to pay. So quality is potentially going to get compromised. Or maybe I'm just bitter because the last time I reviewed for BMC Medical Ethics, they ignored my review and took the paper anyway.
Thanks, Angus. But yeah, it's like talking about peer review in the current neoliberal academic industry in itself, like publishing industry, it's like makes us think critically about many aspects of why we do what we do. But at the same time, we think about academia as a way of, contributing. We are learning with each other. We are growing together. But at the same time, there is this neoliberal mechanism which we are feeding into. So yeah, that's another whole aspect to think about. Whom should we peer review for, right? Those questions are there. And I know now we are running out of time. So in the last minutes, do you have any last thoughts or comments or tips for early career researchers who, you have received many early career researchers peer reports, right? Like what are the ways you would think, if you want to suggest, like, how do we improve better? You have already covered, but just the last bit.
I think my last tip is the tip that I give to my PhD students. Be kind in your review. Don't be indulgent. Don't be too lenient. But don't write something you wouldn't like to read about your paper in a way, because sometimes, I mean, I've received very, very critical reviews that were quite salty, and you don't like receiving them, so don't write them. Write as if, you would receive, it has to be constructive. That's the bottom line. I think that's the most important thing about reviewing. And then as an author, you do your best, and hope your best, and there will be rejections and there will be acceptances, and that's just part of who we are. And I'm always amazed about people that kind of come out and declare, very established professors saying, I've been rejected, very, established female professor that I admire saying, it's been very tough. I've received this terrible review today and I've been rejected for that grant, and that's just been a terrible day. And I think there's a lot of strength in being open about this too. It affects all of us, and we need to be a bit kinder in the way we do all of this process.
Thank you, Sabrina. Vijay, Angus, yes, Angus.
I think that's great advice, and yeah, I think the most recent rejection I got, which was only last month, I felt was really, really unfair. I thought the reviewers, it was a paper that I responded to reviewers, I resubmitted it, and then they got yet another reviewer. I assume that one of the original reviewers said that they weren't going to review it again, so they then got a third reviewer in at the second stage, who then wanted to basically grind some personal axes in relation to the paper. I don't know whether they guessed who the author was or what was going on there. But basically, with our journal, we deliberately choose not to get a new reviewer at the stage of a revised paper, because we think it's unfair. You're basically, you've had a review process, you've had at least 2 reviewers give reports. In most cases, just occasionally we can only ever find 1, but normally you'd have 2. And if you've responded to those reviews and given reasons why you might choose not to respond to particular comments, I think it's part of the editorial process to try and manage that in a way which is fair to everybody, both the reviewers and the authors. And I personally think that it's unfair to introduce new issues later on and then use that as the grounds for rejecting a paper. But maybe that's just me being bitter again. But I think everybody is going to get rejected at some stages, and sometimes that can be for good reasons and sometimes not so good reasons.
Thank you, Angus. I think it's always right. We are both receiving and giving in. And then how do we be kind, as Sabrina also mentioned? I mean, some of the review comments, it takes me at least a week to keep it up back and then, respond. But at the same time, I don't want to be mean to them and they are mean to me. So it's like a way to, it's such a conversation to have always. But yeah, thanks. Vijay, any last thoughts?
from a reviewer's perspective, I think peer reviewing is largely a very thankless job. It takes a lot of hours of our time, but very little in terms of actual tangible returns. But I think we need to do it for the spirit of maintaining integrity of academia. And like Angus said, in the broad sense, if we can do one or two peer reviews for a few, in a week or something like that, or 5 or 6 in a month, I think that's a reasonable contribution that we can give to academia. And I think nowadays a lot of incentivization of peer review is happening. In fact, Publons, as somebody had mentioned, there is some recognition in Publons. There are peer reviewer certificates that are being given, and credits in promotions and tenure tracks and all of those things. And in fact, some models, in fact, interestingly, one journal in India is now trying to pay peer reviewers. There are talks and there are discussions going on about paying peer reviewers per review. Again, that opens up a whole floodgate of issues and conflicts of interests and things like that, which would be an interesting discussion for another time maybe. But I think my last point is this: it's quite a thankless job, but we need to do it for preserving integrity of academia.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's so for me, the way I have grown to whatever my early career stage at this I think I'm very thankful to many editors and many reviewers who I really sometimes want to just hug them because they've really given such a constructive feedback, because it helps you grow. But at the same time, there are, of course, challenges with some reviews. So it's always like, you get different ways. But thank you so much for being on this 2-hour workshop for everyone here, but especially for speakers here, Sabrina, Angus, and Vijay. Thank you for accepting and being here with us and making time on your Friday. Thank you. I really appreciate this. Thank you all.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Hi.